So today's daf is daf A, and on the very bottom of daf Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara is Kash on Rabbah. Rabbah holds that the takana requiring the shliach to recite the Funny Nechtam was based on the fact of that in Chutz La'aretz, in Medina Sayyam, they weren't Bekiyim B'Lishma. And the Mishnah later on, Adaf Tes Amud Beis, Tnan, Hamevi Get Medina Sayyam, Ve'eno Yochel Lomar B'Fanei Nechtam, Im Yeshalav Edim Yiskayim B'Chosmav. So we have a Mishnah that speaks about Eino Yochel Lomar. We'll have to figure out what Eino Yochel Lomar is, and why is it that he cannot declare B'Fanei Nechtam. But in any event, in such a case, the Mishnah establishes that will bring Adam to testify that we recognize the two signatures on the get. They are authentic and not forged. There's no forgery here. And this itself, by the way, is a kash on Rabbah, even before we get through the whole discussion here that we're about to embark upon about what Eino Yochel Lomar means. Because what good is it, according to Rabbah, if you establish that the two Adam signed on the get? Okay, you've solved the problem of the authenticity, and you've rejected any sort of forgery, but you haven't solved the problem of lishma. And later on, B'li Neder, if we can, we're going to try to figure out why the Gemara doesn't stop here and raise the objection to Rabbah. But in any event, Vavinabo, we try to understand the Mishnah, Mai Eino Yochel Lomar. What is this case of a shliach who cannot recite B'Fanei Nechtam? And now we start today's daf Hey. If we're going to say he's a cheresh is a deaf mute who's considered a lav bar das, and the shliach is incapable of speaking because he's mute. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because cheresh bar aisuye gitahu. Are you assuming that the cheresh is a kosher, a shliach, to bring a get vatnan? We have a Mishnah on Daf Chav Gimel, Akol Ksherim Lo Avis Get Chus Michereshot V'Katan. So the cheresh is possible for Havas Haget. He cannot be a shliach to bring the get. So this is not a simple. This is not simply a problem of the incapability of the shliach in this circumstance to proclaim and declare B'Fanei Nechtam. We have a more basic fundamental issue here, and he cannot be a shliach. And the reason he cannot be a shliach is first and foremost because he's a lav bar das. There may be a special reason in Gerushin why he cannot be a shliach, and that's because you need a bar hachi of ishus, and on a deraisa level, he's not capable of ishus. In any event, the Omer Rav Yosef, so Rav Yosef interprets the Mishnah that we're not talking about a mute, but rather, the shliach already delivered the get to the hands of the woman, shupikeach, and therefore his functioning as a shliach was perfectly valid. Let's say there was a short period of time in which the shliach following the Mesiras Haget will make his declaration. And in that short period of time, unfortunately, he became a cheresh, and therefore he became a lav bar das. He's now mute, and he's incapable of reciting the formula of B'Fanei Nechtam. And the Gemara says, L'Rava Nicha, L'Rabba Kash. So according to Rava, the issue here, in the absence of the edus of the shliach B'Fanei Nechtam is maybe the signatures on the shtar were forged, and for that we have here Yiskayim B'Chosma, but we solve that problem. But according to Rabbah, that the issue is Lishma. How do you solve the problem of Lishma, clarifying that there was written Lishma by the fact that the Adam who signed, there's a valid, authentic signature? That doesn't seem to address the issue of Lishma. Now, Tosas Dibra Maskal Ilema is going to raise the question that we raised before. Why did the Gemara have to go through this whole Shakalitaria to try to understand what an Eino Yochel means here in this case? Forget about the whole scenario. I mean, the Gemara could have simply raised the objection to Rabbah. How could it be the Iskay B'chosmam? How's that going to solve your problem of clarifying that it was written Lishma? I mean, there's two different issues. There's one issue about whether it was written Lishma, another issue about whether or not these are valid, authentic signatures. So he has a summary here. He says, Madua Gemara lo ma'amida shemedubar be'ilim sheyesh lo das rak eno mesugal l'dam. Fine. He gives those possible scenarios. Then he quotes the Rashba, Madua hoisa tzricha Gemara lahakdim lifnei kushas al rabba v'avinim ba mai ve'eno yochol, and to bring the teretz of Rav Yosef, har kushal rabba b'loshen ha'mishnis kain b'chosma. The Tiretz HaRashba. So we have now the Rashba's answer. Why does this Mishnah make sense according to Rava? When we say that Yiskayim B'chosmav, Pshita Maiko Mashma, if the Shliach does not function and achieve the goal of being Mekayim, the Chasimos by declaring B'fan Nechtam V'ay Nechtam, we have to be Mekayim with Eden. So the Gemara therefore quotes Rav Yosef, who says we're talking about a shliach who was a pikeach at the time of the Mesira. He became a cherish after the Mesira Saget, and therefore, according to Rav, there's a chidush here. Without the Mishnah, I would have said that if Chachamim were mekil with regard to the chashash of aguna, and they said that the shliach could be mekayim the get with his declaration, you don't even need to aid them, even though it's a davar sheba'erev gerushin, then maybe they would make him because of aguna in the case of a shliach who doesn't have the capacity of reciting and enunciating the words of fani nechtam, and maybe they drop the requirement of kiyum completely. The Maharsha, on the other hand, offers a second approach. The Gemara's kash on Rabbah is only after the hesber of Rav Yosef to the Mishnah. Because Tosfos asked the question, why didn't they interpret the Mishnah as referring to a case of a mute person who has the capacity to hear, and therefore he's a yeshbo das, but just he's not able to speak, he's mute. Now, if the Mishnah was talking about an Elam, as Tosfos asks in his Kasha, then there would be no objection to Rabbah, because an Elam is capable of writing down in front of Bezdin, b'fani nechtam. Now that's going to be meaningful as far as the issue of Lishma. But as far as Eidos Kiyum Shtaris is concerned, the Rabbanan required Kiyum Shtaris in front of a Bezdin of 3, and we have a psul of mipim v'lo pich savam, and therefore he cannot write down his edus on a piece of paper. And therefore, there's no possibility of kiyum ashtar, unless we bring two other edim who could be mekayim the shtar. But clearly, the shliach himself cannot be mekayim the shtar because he's mute, even though he's a bar das and he's a bar shmir. But afterwards, when the Gemara realizes that it cannot be possible that the interpretation of the Mishnah is referring to an Elam, and we have now Rav Yosef's interpretation of the Mishnah, that the only possibility of interpreting the Mishnah is a pikech v'nischaresh, which means that now he's at the state in which he has no das at all. So therefore, even if he were able to be Mekayim the Shtar, he's not capable of doing so, because as we said before, for the Kiyum Shtars we need Eidus B'Peh. Now we have a Kash on Rabbah. So why isn't the Mishnah worried about Shalol Lishma? What good is it to be Mekayim the Chasimos by introducing two Eidim? That's the marshal. The Gemara answers, there was a period of time after which the Bnei Medina Sayyam were very acute, very, very up to date on the requirement of Lishma. And we could rely on the fact that they, in fact, guaranteed and supervised that the get was written Lishma. So Gemara asks, Yachol Nami, even if the shliach is capable of saying Fani Nechtam, why do we require Fani Nechtam at all? If the people from Medina Sayyam now got to the point where they know Lishma, so they became Lishma, so you're telling me, well, if a shliach cannot testify b'fanei nechtam, then we have to bring in Edei Kiyum to be Makayim the Chasimos. Even if the shliach was capable of saying b'fanei nechtam, we shouldn't require b'fanei nechtam. And the Gemara says, Gzera Shem Yachsa double Kilkula. The Chachamim were always suspicious that maybe at some point in the future, again, the situation will go back to its original state, in which the Bnei Medina Sayyam will forget this requirement of Lishma, and therefore they left the takana in its place that the shliach must recite b'fanei nechtam, even though they, right now in the present state, currently, they know b'fanei nechtam, they know about Lishma. So Gemara asks, Yehochi and Yochel Nami, if the Chachamim left the takana in its original state, so why is it that if the shliach cannot recite Fani Nechtam, why didn't they passel the get? Because again, you have a problem of Lishma, even though there's no problem of Lishma, but Shem Yachsa is Hadavar L'Kula. So Gemara answers that this case of a shliach was a pikeach at the time that he gave the get, and Tochadei Dibur, after he was Moser the get to the Isha, and this Charish became a Chera, Sheina Shomeh Bein B'Dam, meaning he's a Lav Bar Das, and he has not yet testified Fani Nechtam. And even though we have a Gzera of Shema Yachsa double Kuklo, but there's a rule, a universal rule in Shas regarding Gzeros and Milslo Shriach, Lo Gazu Rabbanan, that the Rabbanan did not impose their Gzeros in a strange case. The possibility of this actual scenario happening is so minute that at the time that he gave the get, he was a pikeach, and then in a few seconds before he said b'fanei nechtam, he became a cherish. That's so rare that the Rabbanan did not impose their gzera in such a case. So Gemara asks, va'isha d'lo shchicha. What about a case of a woman who brings her get, and the Baal gave her the get al manas on a t'nai that the gerushin shouldn't be chal until she arrives in a bezdin in Eretz Yisrael? That's also lo shchicha. And yet, usnan, we have a Mishnah later on in Chav Gimel, va'isha atzma v'via gita b'vat shetzricha lomar b'fanei nechtam. So we see that the Chachamim made a takana in all cases, even if it's a milsa lo shchicha. Now, even though we have a principle of milsa lo shchicha lo gozu be'rabbanan, apparently in certain cases there were exceptions, and they made the takana despite the fact that it should include everything, despite, or even if it's a milsa lo shchicha. So Gemara answers, Shlo tachlog b'shlichus. The Chacham did not want to make a distinction between one shliach and the other. So if a shliach can say b'fanei nechtam, even in a case where it's not shliach, the Chacham said we're going to make a takana, and the shliach has to recite b'fanei nechtam. So too in the case of an isha, when she brings her own get, she'll have to recite b'fanei nechtam, testify b'fanei nechtam. And if the shliach is not capable of saying b'fanei nechtam, then iskayim a get b'chosma v'dayo. It's enough that we validate the signatures on the get, and we're not going to make distinctions between one shliach and the other. So Gemara says, "Yehachi bal nami." What about the case of the Baal who brings his get from Medina Sayyam, And if the Chacham are not making a distinction between one shliach and the other, then he, the Baal, should be required to testify Fanei Nechtam, Fanei Nechtam. Aloma Tanya, why do we have a Bryce that says who Atzmo Shevigito ain't Tzarech Lom Fanei Nechtam, Fanei Nechtam? So you see that the Chacham are making a distinction between one case of a shliach and another. Like our answers, time of my Omer Rabbanon. Why did the Rabbanon insist that Tzarech Lomar, that the Baal himself has to testify Fanei Nechtam, Fanei Nechtam? Dilma Osi Baal Ma'aru Posel. After he gives the get to his wife, the Baal is going to come and be ma'arer on the kashus of the get. He's going to taina that the get was written shalol lishma, but hashta minkit nakit le biyadeh. But now that he himself is holding on to the get, and he's bringing the get, verure kamim arale. Are we going to now suspect the possibility that after he delivers the get to his wife, he's going to now raise a question about the kashrus of the get, and he's going to say it's shalol lishma? Now we have another raisa that will refute Rabbi Shita Tashma, Debai Minei Shmuel Mirafuna Shnayim. I'm sorry, this is not a raisa, my mistake. Shnayim Sheviu get Mimedina Sayam. So now you have two shluchim that are bringing the get from Chutz La'aretz, and the question is, tzrichim sheyomer fanei nechtam or ein tzrichim? Now, as far as Lishma is concerned, the fact that there are two shluchim, that's not going to make a dent of a difference. It can only make a difference in the context of Rava's business about Kiyum, that these two shluchim will serve as eidim and they'll be mekayim the get. Amalei ein tzrichim. There's no need for the two shluchim to testify Fanei Nechtam, Fanei Nechtam. All they have to do is testify that they were appointed and commissioned by the Baal to be a shliach. And the reason is, Ma ilu yomru, the two Eidim would say, Fanenu Gersha, that we saw the Gerushin take place. We were there, present at the time of the Gerushin. Is therefore Milo Mehemdi. They wouldn't be believed. If two Eidim testify that we saw the Gerushin, they would be believed. And therefore, should we not believe them when they bring the get and they testify that the Baal sent them as a shliach? So now we have the two shluchim, l'Rav Anicha, l'Rav Akash. According to Rav, we understand very well that since there are two shlichim, we don't need the Fanei Nechtam, because the only issue is Kiyum HaGet. And we have two Eidim available here to be Mekayim the get, meaning the two shluchim. But according to Rabbah, who says that we have to suspect that maybe the get was written Shalol Lishma, then even in the case of two shluchim who came from Medina Sayyam, and it's chash that the get was written Shalol Lishma, they would certainly be required to testify Fanei Nechtam. So why did Rav Huna give this answer? Again, one could argue that Rabbah doesn't have to be committed to Rav Huna, but the Gemara would rather, Rav Huna was the Rosh Shiva, the Gadol Hador, they would rather reconcile Rav Huna with Rabbah if they could. And the Gemara answers, again, we're going to go through the whole Shakla V'Tarya that we did before. We're talking about after the Bnei Medina Sayyam learned and understood that Lishma is an absolute requirement. So therefore, if that's the period of time, then we have no issue about Lishma. And likewise, we have no issue about Kiyum Hashtar because we have the two Shluchim that can serve as two Eidim. So okay, you know what? Even in the case of one Shliach, we should drop the requirement of Fanei Nechtam, because according to Rabbah, the requirement is to establish Lishma, and now it's Lachash Alamdu. And the same answer that we had earlier, Gzeir Shem Yachzeh Double L'Kulkula. So the Gemara asks, Hachi Beitrei Nami. Even in the case where two people brought the get, with two shluchim, they should still be required to declare and testify Fanei Nechtam, because they never repealed that Gzeira. And the Gemara answers, Beitrei de Maisu Gita Milslo Shlicha Lagazri Rabban. That it's very unusual and rare for two shluchim to be appointed to carry the get. The get is not heavier than one person can carry. So Gemara says, okay, so you're telling me that lo gazu be'Rabbanan va'isha lo shchicha and utnan isha atzma via gita v'vad she atzma tzricha lo b'fanei and how commonplace is it for a woman to bring her own get, and the Baal made a t'nai that the get shouldn't be chal until she gets in front of a bezdin in Eretz Yisrael. And you're going to answer shelo tachlo kash b'shlichus, that they didn't want to differentiate between one shliach and another. So if one shliach who brings the get, in a case that's shchiach, we were masakin and required fanei nechtam fanei nechtam. And therefore, even in another case of a shliach, like for example the isha, which is lo shliach, nevertheless, we're going to require fanei nechtam hachi bal nami. If that be the case, that the Baal who brings his own get should certainly have to recite fanei nechtam. Aloma Tananya, why do we have a brisa that says who be'atzmo? If the Baal himself, shevi gito, eino tzorich lom fanei nechtam. And the Gemara answers, as we're familiar with this logic, time of my omer abundant should tzorich lom fanei nechtam, dilmasi Baal ma'aru posule. But what are the chances that the Baal himself delivers the get, and then he's going to say the get was posel? I was playing a joke with you, like it was a game. It was written shalol lishma, and therefore, hashta minka noket leviyadi v'arurei kamarole. We don't have to be worried about the possibility that the Baal himself be ma'ar. Tashma, another raya against Rabbah. Maybe get me. This is from Brisa. Maybe get me this hayam unesano la. That all we need is to be Makayim the get in the absence of the Shliach's testimony of Fanei Nechtam. We need two witnesses to recognize the signatures on the get, to establish that there was no ziyuv, and we're not worried about Lishma. Hevei, you should say lo chutzrachu lomar fanei nech lahachmer lehakil. Right, we only want to be makil on her, and if she has to prove that this get was valid, we want to guarantee that we have a built-in kiyum hachasimos, and therefore they were makil. The Rava Nichol, the Rabba Kash, according to Rava, the whole issue is Kiyum Hashtar, so we have the Kiyum Hashtar over here. I mean to say, we're not going to be Machmir, and in the absence of the Kiyum of the Shliach, we're going to passel the get. No. We're not going to passel the get because we did a Takana L'Tovasa to protect her interests, and we required L'Chatchila that the Shliach testify Fanei Nechtam. Now the Shliach is not testifying Fanei Nechtam. We're not going to passel the get, but L'Rava Kasha, we should passel the get because we haven't established any proof that the get was written Lishma. And again, the Gemara is going to go through the Shakla V'Tarya. And now we're going to assume that Liachar Shalamdu be the Eved, at least the get is kosher. But you said the Gzeir Shem Yachzor Dover L'Kulkulo. All right. L'Chatchila, we're worried about Lishma. But now she received the get. There was no testimony on behalf of the Shliach, on the part of the Shliach, to establish that it was written Lishma. And Kshanisa, she went ahead based on the get that she received, and she got married. So now the Chachamim have to decide whether or not to bust up this marriage. And the Chachamim said, you know what? Let's just rely on Kiyum HaGet. Let's establish beyond the shadow of a doubt that the get was written. It's authentic. There was no forgery. And even though this is not the way the Chacham were masakin, it wasn't really a fulfillment because we have a problem with Shema because of Gzeira Shema Yachzor Hadover L'Kulkulo. Here, we're going to say the following. that the Rabbanan are not going to be so makpid about a gzeira of Shamayaksa, double kukulo, which is also brings us back to the gzeira of maybe the get was not written lishma, so we have here really a gzeira. In such a case, we're not going to bust up the marriage and all the repercussions, ramifications of mamzeris, etc. If b'di'eved she received her get and she got married without b'fanei nechtam, and all we're going to require is this kaim b'chosma. Ihachi, the Gemara, when the Brisa says hevei, you should say lo hutzcha lo b'fanei nechtam lachmer olel hakel oleha. What are you talking about? Mishum de nisesu. The only reason for the kula is not because the takana of a funny nechtam was lahakil, so that in case she needs kiyum haget, we're going to rely on the shliach for kiyum haget to makayim the chasimus of the get. Leave that all out. The real point here is that the reason why we're not going to passel the get based on the absence of funny nechtam vechem is because she already got married. Here's how we have to interpret the Brisa. Allah. Maybe we should be machmir and havel lafka. We should bust up the marriage in a case of nises because there was no kiyum of the takana of the chachamim, and we'll see that we're going to have a sheet of Rabbi Meir later on of kol mishanim yad be'eshet tov chachamim is havlad mamzer. Is heavy over no lo hutzulom for the next even if you want to bust up the marriage, we're going to say that Takanas Chacham was only to be make it on her. But now you want to be machra and bust up a marriage and be motzia mi baila. No. That far we're not going to go.